were some amazing words in some of those songs. Let's just all sing. I love that prayer in Ephesians 1:17 where it says, Father, give us spirit of wisdom and revelation in the knowledge of Him. And then I was reminded in Isaiah where it says, morning by morning, you awaken my ear to hear as one being taught. So why don't we just do that right now, each one personally and online as well? Why don't you just personally just speak to the Spirit of truth? Thank you, Lord. Thank you for the spirit of revelation and truth that syncs us and links us to your voice. Thank you, Abba. Amen. So we've done a little series yesterday and finalizing today. Yesterday we started looking at the themes of faith, hope, and today we're going to conclude with the theme of love. Now the subject of love is one of those subjects where oh my goodness, where do you begin? And what do you say that's not just sentimental jargon, something that's real? Because actually, imagine having to explain to somebody love. Even the love that you might have for your partner, if you're really honest, you don't quite know how to explain it. Now, let me give you a hint. If your wife comes to you and say, why do you love me? Do not say, I've got no clue. That's not the right answer. It might be an honest answer, but at least try. But if you think of it, if you have to tell your wife, it's the way you laugh, or it's the way you smile, it's your eyes. Does that mean that if there's another girl that comes around who's got a similar laugh, you're going to love her just as much? No, so it's not really her laugh. If there's somebody with the similar eyes, or it's difficult to attach your love to any one specific quality or any one specific attribute of another person. And so when we say love, each one of you have got so many places that you go to. And love is so diverse because the way I love my son is different from the way I love my wife. The way I love my wife is different from the way I love my father. The way you love your parents is different from the way you love your friends. Yeah, so there's an enormous diversity within this quality that we kind of summarize under the subject of love. And so very often we make these generalized statements that might be applicable in one area and not in another. And it's because of that I am so thankful for the way in which Jesus comes to unveil what it means to love, what love looks like, in a way that can be relevant in every relationship that we touch on. So we touched on faith and hope yesterday, but love becomes a basis for all of those other qualities. Because if there is no love, all of this stuff is really meaningless. Love is what brings beauty and meaning to our hope, to our faith. And so I'm going to take a very specific example out of the book of John in which Jesus demonstrates to us what love looks like. And then he actually gives us, in that same chapter, a very clear instruction to imitate him in loving the way he loved. In other words, Jesus doesn't just give us a teaching and then says, go and do what I taught you. Jesus actually demonstrates something that we can observe, and then he tells us to go and do likewise. Now, we often use the word mimetic or mimesis. It comes from a Greek word mimetes in Ephesians 5, where he says, mimetis, imitate the Father. It's where we get our word imitate or to copy or to observe and to do the same as what you see. But I'm going to start off with John 13. Maybe let me start off with different levels of imitation. No, let's just start off with the scripture. So, John 13. Let me start from verse 3. Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands and that he had come from God and was going back to God, rose from supper. He laid aside his outer garments and taking a towel, tied it around his waist. Then he poured water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet and to wipe them with the towel that was wrapped around him. Okay, then he comes to Simon Peter's hilarious character, because he says, no, don't wash my feet. And then Jesus says, well, if you don't let me wash your feet, you've got no part in it. And then Peter says, well, wash everything of me that you can find. And Jesus, it's quite comic. He kind of brings it back and says, okay, I don't need to wash everything, just your feet, because you're clean already. Verse 12, when he had washed their feet and put on his outer garment and resumed his place, and he said to them, do you understand what I have done? You call me teacher and Lord, and you are right, for I am. If I then, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. For I have given you an example that you should do just as I have done to you. So I'm going to quickly look at how this process of imitation works. Now, the whole book of John is full of invitations where Jesus asks his disciples to follow him and to remain with him. And part of following and remaining with Jesus is that process gives us an example that we can imitate. Now, imitation works on a number of different levels. We don't always like the word imitation, do we? Because imitation sounds like it's not authentic. You know, if something's an imitation, it's not real. And so, to a large extent, we've kind of backtracked from this idea of imitation. We don't really enjoy the fact that I imitate anything because I want to be my authentic self, my true self. And we've developed the idea that to be authentic means that I do not imitate anyone or anything. Well, the truth is you wouldn't be able to speak if you did not have the capacity to imitate. Imitation is what makes you human. The fact that you can dress yourself It's because from a very early age you imitated what you saw, what your parents taught you. The fact that you can speak is testimony to the power of imitation. Being authentic is not the opposite of imitation. They work together. There's a capacity to reflect within the human nature that helps us develop into our true selves. Now, let me give a practical example. And I love the example of art because my granddad and my dad, to a certain extent, were artists. And there are certain ways in which artists learn to paint. In fact, a few years ago, was it the same trip that I spoke of yesterday, just before we cycled to Switzerland? I think it was. While we were in the Netherlands, somebody took us to the Van Gogh art museum. Oh my goodness. Stunning stuff. What was very interesting for me is, Van Gogh decided to be an artist quite late in life. Actually, he wanted to be a missionary, but he didn't quite make the grade. Well, he wanted to be just a minister, and he didn't quite make the grade, and so they said, well, maybe you can be a kind of missionary in this community, somewhere, a mining community. And during one of the accidents that happened in the mine, he was helping the wounded as their vicar, as their minister in this town. And he had the audacity to take his shirt off to bind up somebody's wound. And the religious institution heard about this disrespectful minister who would take his shirt off in public. So he got fired from being a minister there. And it was during that time, if you read a bit of his correspondence, that he started drawing down to what is it that I am passionate about doing. And he always avoided art because it seemed to him to be too vain and not as spiritual as what he wanted to pursue. But in a sense, he prayed, I want to do art, but Lord, I want to capture the beauty beyond what is just visible on the surface. And so he started learning from other artists. And what was interesting at this museum is that there was correspondence between him and some of the other artists, but there were a few pieces of correspondence between different artists. Because Van Gogh would go and he would spend a few days with one guy trying to learn the style and the painting, and he'd go to another artist and try and learn that style. And the artists that tried to help him wasn't very hopeful that he was going to get anywhere with his art. In fact, one was quite condescending in his letter, saying, he's trying, but, I don't really, you've either got it or you don't. And I don't think he's got it. By the way, the artist that wrote that letter, I can't even remember his name. And I don't think you'll recognize it if I say it. But all of you remember Van Gogh. Because he persistently copied and imitated. Now, in art, what makes it a great example is to help us understand that there are different levels of imitation. On one level, I can stand next to the master and imitate every movement. This is the way you hold the brush. You dab it in that paint, you mix it with that medium, etc. And then exactly copy where does he make the mark upon the canvas. Can you understand that there's a way of copying that is an exact replication of the master? And that is probably where we all begin, even as children. Your parents just shows you how to hold the pen and how to make a mark. We start learning in a very basic manner. But then the imitation takes another form as you start imitating not every brush stroke, but you start observing the technique. Now, there's many techniques in art, but maybe one technique is I start with all the dark colors and I start with the background, and then I work my way forward towards lighter colors and the foreground. There's some techniques that's the exact opposite. But do you understand that as you learn, you start to imitate not just every brush stroke, but you start to imitate the technique behind that brush stroke. Now, the kind of art that Van Gogh was involved in, it was called post-impressionism, and it's kind of, to understand it, impressionism basically, the aim is to not capture a photorealistic image of what you're capturing, but to simply give an impression so that the observer can become involved in completing the picture. So it tries to capture the movement and the light and the colors in such a way that the observer will be involved in completing the picture. That's why with many of those artworks, if you go and stand right in front of it, it makes no sense. You don't see you see little blotches of color and paint, and it's actually as you withdraw that your eyes start to mix all the different colors together and the image appear, but it appears because you actively involved in creating this image. So it's a beautiful art form. Now, post-impressionism, what Van Gogh was involved in was, it just has a different take on how you use colors. They don't mind so much whether the colors are realistic as long as it's the right tone. Your mind still creates the right picture. That's why you can look at some of his portraits, and if you look closely, the guy's skin is green and purple and all the colors you imagine, but if you go back a bit, all the tones just settle down and you recognize the face. Now, the third level of imitation, so what was the first level of imitation? Is an exact copy. The second level of imitation is where I imitate the technique and the larger processes involved. But the third level of imitation is where I realize the underlying desire or goal of what I'm trying to achieve. And this is what made Van Gogh a master that we all recognize today. He didn't simply imitate the brush strokes. He understood that what I want to capture is the movement. What I want to capture is the life and the beauty below the surface of what is visible. You see, I can imitate the action of another without it affecting who I am. I can imitate the technique of another without being personally changed in any form or fashion. But I cannot imitate the desire of another without being transformed by that desire, because desire is not just the attribute of what makes me me. Desire is the very movement that carves me. Desire is a movement that's integral to what and who I am. And so in Van Gogh's imitation of all the other artists, he combined different techniques, but most importantly, he understood the desire of what this art form wanted to communicate. And that desire transformed him into one of the most recognizable artists we know. Now, what does this have to do with Jesus washing feet and asking us to imitate him? Well, what does it mean to imitate Jesus? And I love the fact that Jesus, the whole pattern of this story is, it shows you that Jesus does something. He gets up, takes off his garments, gets the water, gets the towel, washes their feet, has a little exchange with Peter, gets up again, puts on his garment, sits down, and his first words are, "Did you understand what I've just done?" So can you see that our imitation of Jesus is not simply on the first level of I just need to copy what Jesus did. He washed feet, let's get buckets, let's wash feet. That in a way, that is a first step. There is a place where I should imitate Jesus without always fully understanding. Like, for instance, if Jesus said, pray for those who persecute you. Maybe you don't fully understand how this works. But because at this stage of being persecuted, all I want really is a bit of revenge. Is a little bit of, I don't fully understand why I should pray for them. Or maybe I do. Lord, kill them, please. No, that's not the kind of praying, obviously, that Jesus had in mind. But so there is a place, like with any learning of a new skill, where I simply copy and I don't have full understanding yet. But we don't stay on that level. We start going deeper. And that is why Jesus, after he washed their feet, he sits down and he says, "Do you understand?" So imitation has got a few steps or processes. The first step of imitation is there's a model that does a certain action. So Jesus doesn't just sit next to the table and say, "Hey guys, wash one another's feet." If he did that and we got up and washed another's feet, that would be obedience. It wouldn't be imitation. There's something much more powerful about imitation than obedience. So Jesus actually does an action. So the first process within imitation is there's an action that can be observed. The second part of imitation, okay, so there's an action. Let me break it down in a few more steps. There's an action. Secondly, I observe the action. I see Jesus getting up, washing feet, doing all of that. I observe it. The third step, Jesus sits back at the table and he says, "Do you understand?" In other words, you now need to interpret what you observed. And then, after you've interpreted what you observed, I think it's verse 17, he says, for you to go and do likewise. Let me quickly read that, verse 17. So, if you know these things, blessed are you if you do them. And that word blessed, blessed are you. It's a state of happiness. This is a transformation of being. But only happens in the act of doing it. Okay? Jesus doesn't say, okay, you've now seen, you've understood, and you can now go away and be proud of the fact that you are followers of Jesus. No, the whole purpose of following Jesus, remember yesterday, what was the fourth quality of the the faith of the resurrected Jesus? There were 4 qualities that we spoke of about that faith. Let's quickly go over them. The first one is, it's surprising. Meeting the resurrected Jesus wasn't expected. It was an unexpected surprise. The second quality was unbearable. It's an event so overwhelming. He's absent and present. He's a stranger, but I recognize him. There's all these confusing qualities present in one moment. The third quality, it transgresses the boundaries of language. We can't define this event in just one statement or one definition. And the last one is, and you can't grasp it. It's not something that you can fully subject to your own understanding, but it's a subject that transforms you in the process of beholding it. Can you see that this is what happens and why Jesus says, follow me? He doesn't say, read about me, understand me well, and pride yourself in your correct interpretation of who I was. Now, there's something about a sincere following of his life, things that you will only understand when you imitate him. So what is it about this love that Jesus demonstrates that we need to imitate that will transform us? You see, I can say so many things, and poets have said so many things about love, but it is only in the act of loving that we begin to understand what it is. It is only in this process of imitating love that it becomes understandable. Now, one of the things that I find powerful right at the beginning of John 13 is the very basis that enables Jesus to give himself and to serve others. You see, it's almost like, remember yesterday we spoke about revelation, and what we really want revelation to be is God confirming how right we've always been. What we really want revelation to be is God just coming to say, yes, I'm just going to give you deeper insight into how right you've always been. But true revelation, according to 1 Corinthians 2 verse 9, is what no eye has ever seen, what no ear has ever heard, what has not entered the imagination of man. In other words, revelation is the shocking, overwhelming encounter with something that doesn't fit into your story, or into your categories of interpretation, or into your doctrine. Revelation is not that tame lion within the zoo that is too ashamed to lift its head and even look at you. Revelation is more like walking in the wild and encountering a creature that has the power to devour you. That's revelation. It's an encounter with something that shatters your story, that devours the identity that you've established yourself, that brings you face to face with a reality much larger than what you can contain. And the same is true, and this is actually the basis of that revelation, is love is not something that I can choose to do or not and remain who I am. For those of you who have loved most deeply, you'll know this, that love transforms you. Love is not something that you've got a little spare bucket in a cupboard and you dish it out every now and then. And then when it gets too inconvenient, you hold the bucket back until it fills up a bit again. No, love is a giving of the self, which in effect is a way of dying. It's giving a part of yourself away. And because of that, it's not something that you can do while yourself is still something that needs to be protected and justified. While I'm still in that mode where this insecure self within the boundaries of its own certainty needs to justify its own rightness and its own existence, it's very difficult to give yourself when you think self is this small little thing you need to protect. That's why verse 3 starts with Jesus knowing that he came from the Father. In other words, his identity is not founded within himself. His identity flows to him from another source, and that he is going back to the Father. It's almost like you need, your whole concept of what self is changes from this static, pre-designed thing called true self to understanding that self is really just supposed to be a stream that has its source somewhere else. And if I stop the flow of this stream by just being content with being myself, by myself, with myself, in myself, you just become a stagnant, green, algae-ridden dam that very few things enjoy living in. This understanding that what I am has its source somewhere else. And for me to truly be myself, I simply need to open up the gates that allows it to flow further, that allows me to give myself for the benefit of others. And the more I give myself, the more the stream flows. I don't become less me by giving me away. I become more truly me by giving me away. In fact, if we can speak of design, I would say this was God's idea from the very beginning, that in your existence, God will have an opportunity to love. And so whenever you love, God is being himself through you. Yesterday, if you weren't here, you can go look at the recording, but I spoke about a near-death experience that Mary Ann had, and one of the ways in which she tried to describe that event is that everything temporal seemed to just disappear, and what was eternal remained, and what was eternal was love. You see, what remains of you is love. The moments in which you've chosen to give yourself, the parts of you that you give away is the only parts that remain forever. The parts of you that you protect and guard, those are the parts that hasn't got any real eternal existence. Now, this doesn't mean that I simply say yes to whatever demand is placed upon me. Sometimes we interpret it that way. But let me show you that there are, ultimately, Jesus, our example, gives himself, but other times he doesn't. For instance, in one instance, he feeds the 5,000. No one expects it. They're happy to go back into town and feed. But he gives himself. He feeds them all. Then later on, people come to him in the desert and they say, "Do it again. That was fabulous. Our forefathers gave us bread in the wilderness. Can you do that? Can you do it again?" And I'm sure he had the capacity to do that, but he recognized that to simply consent to their demand would not be to their benefit. Okay, so love is not mindlessly giving yourself. There's an understanding to this imitation, and part of that understanding is this action to the benefit of another? And sometimes demands might be placed on you, and people might think, "I think it's a good thing for you to do this for me, and I think you should love me in this way." But this love has the ultimate good of another in its understanding. So Jesus, being aware that he came from the Father, is able to serve because his identity is not threatened by the act of humiliating himself. Because, washing the feet, that kind of happened by the slaves used to wash the feet of the guests coming into the house. So what is it about Jesus' self-understanding that says, I can humble myself to the lowest level possible and not feel humiliated by that act? It's this very understanding that the source of my identity is not the opinions of others. The source of my identity is not even just my own self-generated opinion of who I am. The source of my existence is a gift that comes to me from another. And its desire is to continue to give itself to the benefit of others. And so this imitation that Jesus speaks of in John 13, can we quickly revisit the things that we've said about it? Number one, there's a model that does something that we can observe. When last did you just contemplate on some of the actions of Jesus? Just observe. Now, why would Jesus allow himself to be falsely accused and not retaliate? Maybe meditate on that little simple idea for a little while. Can you see that if you give yourself to this subject, it has the potential to transform you? Just meditate on that one little thing. Jesus is falsely accused, but refuses to justify himself. I mean, you can take a year, meditate on that one. That will, and then after you maybe receive understanding from that meditation, remember verse 17? It says, blessed are you, that means a transformation in your state of being, if you do this. In other words, I don't just want to understand why Jesus did it. I want to understand why he did it so that I can do it with the same understanding. Maybe just meditate on the idea that Jesus didn't just allow others to falsely accuse him without retaliating. He could have called down 10,000 angels to help him justify his case, but he allows others to actually harm him, to eventually kill him. And then he gets the greatest opportunity of all. God raises him from the dead. I mean, isn't this the dream of every victim? I want God to justify me. And he doesn't just say God raised him from the dead. He seated him and gave him the throne of judgment. Oh yes, bring those enemies back. It is judgment time. But Jesus, in his resurrection, facing the very ones who falsely accused him and murdered him, chooses to forgive. Whew. Isn't this what it means to follow Jesus? Is to consider how he lived, how he died, how he acted, and try to understand why. This is why he gave us the Spirit of truth. And then ultimately what it means to follow is not just to stand at the distance and say, okay, now I understand why he did it. But to follow means that I'm going to find myself in the same situations that Jesus found himself in. I'm going to be on that same path, but I will have a model that I can imitate. And what I imitate will not just be a mindless copy, but it will be a creative, faithful interpretation of his desire that manifests in my life in a unique and creative way. And that is what makes you authentic. That you imitate the underlying desire of God. And you cannot imitate the desire without being transformed by that desire. Glory. Thank you, Papa. Thank you, Papa. This is good news. The same Spirit that raised Jesus from the dead, the same Spirit that guided him and directed him, has been freely given to you. So that in whatever situation you find yourself in, you have a model whose actions you can observe, contemplate, and whose life and desires you can reflect to have an authentic expression in your life. And in that sense, Jesus comes again in your existence. In that sense, the Father's desire that his thoughts, his logic, his words should become flesh continues to be realized in your existence. Because in you, the incarnation continues. See, that's why in John 1:14, where it says, and the Word became flesh, we often read that and we immediately only think about Jesus. He was the Word that was in the beginning, that was with God, that was God, and the Word became flesh. And we ignore the verse before that gives us a wonderful context, because the verse before, verse 13, is not speaking about Jesus, it's actually speaking about you. Verse 13 says, you were born, not of the will of man, nor of the will of flesh, but of God. And the thoughts of God became flesh and dwelt in us. And of his fullness have we all received grace upon grace. You see, Ephesians 1 verse 4 speaks about the God who dreamed about you, who named you and called you even before the foundation of this world. And what he dreamed and thought about you then so excited him that he said, I've got to put some flesh onto this thought. I've got to give this dream a body. And what God knew about you then is still his only reference to who you are. Your life has not confused him. Might have confused you many times. But God is not confused about the beauty, the meaning, the value he sees in your existence. It's in the midst of this world of contrasts, this world of contradictions, that the true light still has an opportunity to shine in your existence. The thought, the dream of God that was in the beginning, that was with God, that was God. All things came into existence through him. And without him, nothing exists that exists. And this word is what ignites your existence. This word is the life of man. And the darkness, no matter how much darkness there is, no matter how much contradiction there is, it has not consumed this light. God still sees in you the possibility for himself to find an expression that is absolutely unique, absolutely authentic, absolutely unrepeatable. He's excited about your life. Hey, every time you love, God is being himself in you. Amen. Mary Ann, do you want to come up? Papa, we thank you for the wonder of the faith of Jesus Christ. Thank you that you have encountered us in the resurrection, that you have taken our breath away. You've astounded us with exposing us to the beauty of the impossible. Thank you that you've birthed within us this living hope, this expectation that we'll continue to be surprised by the goodness of our Abba. And Papa, we thank you for giving us your Spirit, the Spirit of truth, that helps us to understand your desire, that helps us to contemplate our living model, Jesus Christ, who has shown us what love looks like. And I pray that wherever we find ourselves, that you will show us what it means to love in that situation. In Jesus' name, thank you, Papa. Amen.
Amen. Is that okay? Should I go back? Yeah, Andre's speaking about transformation and how many of you know how difficult it is to change somebody's mind? I mean, somebody that is invested in a certain idea, in a certain belief, how virtually impossible it is to change their minds. Yet only in the demonstration of love is transformation possible. And when I was meditating on just how, in what's given me such compassion with other people who might not see things the way I do, is to realize what it took God to change our minds. And so this was really a song that I felt he sang to me, saying, what did it take to change your angry mind? What did it take to change your mind? Show you that I always have been kind. And what did it take to heal your heart? Show you that you always have been part of me. Part of me. And did it turn you around when at your worst love abounds, suffers at the hands of angry man, bearing the hatred you began when I became you and showed you the truth. And what did it take to make you see the truth about me and the truth about you? What did it take to make you see the fear you hide behind? Hide behind. For I faced your death with my last breath, gave up the life that gave you birth to show you what you're worth when I became you and showed you the truth. That I am not your problem, I'm not the angry one, I am your father. It's your heart I want. Won't you drop your illusions? I invite you to see that there's no being you, no being you. There's no being you without me. And in the midst of your fear, I am near. In the depths of your pain, I'll bear it just the same. When all hope is gone, I say, come on. Come on, for I am not your problem. you drop your illusions, I invite you to see that there's no being you. There's no being you. No, there's no being you without me. But there's so being you. There's so being you. Yes, there's so being you with me. So being you with me. Won't you be quiet for a moment? Silence is calling you into the depths of the mystery, beyond what you can see. You'll find me waiting. No judgment, no temporary fixes. In love's security, a whole new world of meaning unfolds inside of you. Whispers of desire, breathing life into the formless chaos, rivers of kindness and mercy, healing flows in ancient wisdom, yet new as the dawn. No judgment, no temporary fixes. In love's security, a whole new world of meaning unfolds inside of you. And there is no fear here. Love is loving you. There is no fear here. Love is loving you. Whispers of desire, breathing life into this formless chaos, rivers of kindness and mercy, healing flows in ancient wisdom, yet new as the dawn. No judgment, no temporary fixes. In love's security, a whole new world of meaning unfolds inside of you, and there is no fear here. Love is loving you. No fear here. Love is loving you. You are seen, you're desired into being.